Hello, I'm Tim Janisewski, and welcome to this bonus lecture to our Spotlight Theology series. What are these bonus lectures? Well, Spotlight Theology, to begin with, is an introduction to what Christians believe and why they believe, and how what they believe and why they believe then makes a significant difference for how we experience our Christian faith and live our Christian faith every day. And that's to say that those 12 lectures in Spotlight Theology are of a basic nature. They are intended to give the 10,000-foot overview to what Christians believe. And in that sense, they are to give the flow or the sense of progression within theology, using those 12 different lectures to represent the different heads or the different major topics within Christian theology. What we're going to do in these bonus lectures is to dive a little more deeply into some of the subjects or topics that are within or contained under the surface of those introductory lectures. And this particular bonus lecture has to do with the subject of salvation. If you had opportunity to listen to the series, we had 2 lectures on the subject of salvation, known as soteriology. And in the first of those 2 lectures, we first laid the foundation, the groundwork for salvation. In fact, I used the image of a riverbed that contains a body of water, a river flowing down that riverbed. That foundational riverbed to our salvation is contained in the 5 solas of the Protestant Reformation. We'll recall that the word sola from Latin means alone. And the riverbed or foundation is that we are saved by Scripture alone, through grace alone, by exercising faith alone, because of the work of Jesus Christ alone, all to the glory of God alone. That was the first lecture. And then in our second lecture on soteriology, we described the flow of salvation as it applies to the life of each individual Christian. That is, this is like the water of salvation that flows down the riverbed of that foundation that we already have laid or had laid. And those indeed we saw include a before to our salvation, that before being from the foundations of the earth and in the atoning work of Jesus. There was a beginning to our salvation where we were regenerated and came to new life in Jesus Christ. We heard the call of God. The Christian then repented of sin and believed in Jesus, exercising faith. It brought about the results of justification before God and adoption into the family of God, all part of this new regenerated life that begins salvation. And then from that we flowed along into sanctification as we mortified the old flesh, the old way of life, and vivified, brought to life everything that is new and in Jesus Christ. And then finally we will see the flow of our salvation consummated and completed as one day we know as we are known, on that final great day of God, a new heavens, a new earth, when we are made complete and we receive resurrection, new bodies forever and ever. If you will, as Reinhold Niebuhr said, there is a sense in which we were saved, we are being saved, and we will yet be saved. So that's the basic introduction foundation that we provided for someone listening to these lectures. Now, where are we going to dive more deeply into the subject matter has to do with the subjects of God's operation to bring about salvation. This has to do with God's sovereignty, words such as God's providence, God's election, and yes, God's foreknowledge or even God's predestination on the one hand. And then on the other hand, the subject of our human free will, our human involvement, how human beings participate in salvation in the Christian life and experience. Let me simply say that on one hand, there is a group or a side of the Protestant evangelical world that if you were to err, if it's possible to err, would err on the side of emphasizing, would uplift, it would say, the sovereignty of God, the choice of God, the involvement of God as being paramount. And then there's another school within evangelical Christianity, Protestant Christianity, that, if you will, tends to, again, if you could err on the side of our responsibility, human free will, the determination of our own destiny and our future as we make our life decisions. Those who are more on the side of God's sovereignty are sometimes said to be Calvinists, who are in the Reformed tradition of Protestantism. And those who tend to emphasize the human free will are said to be Arminians, or more free will in their orientation. So this is the subject that we're going to dive into in this bonus lecture. We're going to do it in 3 steps. Step 1 will be a brief historical overview of how we came to have these 2 schools or 2 fulcrums of emphasis within Protestantism. Secondly, we will answer 5 crucial questions about this subject. First of all, from the Reformed perspective, the Calvinistic perspective, and then from the Arminian or free will perspective, so you can kind of compare and contrast between the 2 of them, hopefully in a way that will bring you some clarity. And then third, I'll finish by giving you 10 questions that will help you diagnose whether you tend to be more of a Calvinist, more on the Reformed, sovereignty of God side of the salvation equation, or more towards the Arminian free will side of this discussion. So let's dive in by taking that quick historical overview. It all began, at least in Protestantism, with the Protestant Reformation, which, as we have seen in our general lectures, our introductory lectures, takes us back to the figure of Martin Luther. And in the mid-15 teens, Martin Luther was having this reformation, this transformation in his own soul concerning his salvation. And that impetus that came from Martin Luther grew in Germany, grew throughout Europe. With the advent of the printing press, his materials were disseminated throughout the Christian world quicker than they ever could have been before. And while Martin Luther was indeed launching the Reformation, another man, Huldrych Zwingli, launching it almost simultaneously in Zurich, Switzerland, there was a young man, a young lad actually at that time, named John Calvin, born in 1509 in France. And John Calvin, therefore, was just 10 or 12 years old when the Reformation started to pick up steam. Now, we don't know exactly when John Calvin professed faith in Christ and moved from being Roman Catholic to Protestant, but probably somewhere around 1530 when he was early 20s. But we do know for sure that by 1536, as a 27-year-old, very young man, he had penned a piece of work called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. And Calvin would continue to revise the Institutes up until 1559. And with no doubt, the Institutes represents the first attempt to write a systematic, organized overview of Christian theology by those who were in the Protestant Reformation movement. And Calvinism, as you can imagine, since it's Calvinistic and Reformed, Calvinism emphasizes the sovereignty of God, the providence of God, the electing purposes of God as the first point and the great point of emphasis when it comes to human salvation. Well, Calvin would do incredible work in Geneva, Switzerland, and the Reform movement would grow. People would come from all over Protestant Christianity to study in Geneva, study with John Calvin. When he died in 1564, he handed over the reins of responsibility to a man named Theodore Beza. And Beza himself was a very capable pastor and theologian, and he would continue the Reformed emphasis in Geneva all the way till 1605. Well, it was while Beza was in charge there in Geneva that a man named James Arminius, a pastor and theologian who was a Dutchman, he came to study in Geneva under Theodore Beza. But instead of being confirmed in the more Calvinistic sovereignty of God, election of God side of things, he found himself disagreeing with Beza and with the emphasis found in Geneva. Instead, he found himself tilting, as you would imagine, towards the human involvement, the human free will, the human participation in our salvation. Well, he died in 1609, but had brought this emphasis towards the human side of the salvation equation with him to the Dutch churches in Holland. 10 years after he died, there was a shootout at the OK Corral in Holland. I know I'm mixing my images there, but it was called the Synod of Dort, a gathering together of the Dutch churches. That's the Synod, and Dort is a city in Holland, D-O-R-D-T. And there, the people who were on the side of Jacob Arminius, or James Arminius, were called the Remonstrants. They were remonstrating in favor of this more human-oriented inclusion into our salvation. And the other side, the Calvinist and Reformed side, and so they presented their cases. And the Calvinistic and Reformed side prevailed in the Church of Holland. And out of that came what famously known is the 5 points of Calvinism with regard to our salvation. It's the acronym TULIP, after that very beautiful flower that often grows in Holland. T stands for total depravity, or that fallenness touches permeates every part of the human being. U stands for unconditional election. God elects whom he will elect without condition to who they are. L stands for limited atonement, or the cross of Christ was for those whom God would call and choose. I, irresistible grace, although Calvinists like to call it efficacious grace. It can be resisted, but it won't be overcome. It will be effective, if you will, but that would ruin the acronym. And then P, the preservation of God's people, or the perseverance of God's people. Well, we would think perhaps that's the end of the story, but plainly it was not, because Arminianism, or the proponents of the Remonstrants, would not go away. They continued to grow in strength despite that decision at Dort in 1618 and 1619. Now, let's come across to the United States with our conversation. Early American Christianity really, by and large, was more Reformed and Calvinistic. Presbyterians were Reformed and Calvinistic in their view. The Congregationalists who came from the Puritans likewise had that more sovereignty of God orientation and emphasis in their beliefs. Even the Anglicans, following what's known as the 39 Articles of Anglicanism, definitely Calvinistic in its sway. And at the beginning, the early Baptists in the United States of America were on the Reformed and Calvinistic end of things. But then came something called the First Great Awakening in the 1740s, 1750s. And on one hand, in this great awakening, spiritual awakening in New England, was a man named Jonathan Edwards, and he was on the Calvinistic Reform side and emphasized it. But on the other side was a very influential character from England, a man named John Wesley. And Wesley was a full-bodied Arminian, in no way a Calvinist. And his incredible influence began to take hold and have quite an effect. By 1790, a denomination called the Wesleyan denomination, or the Methodist denomination, was being planted in the United States, and it would be fully Arminian and certainly not Calvinistic with regard to salvation. That is to again say it was emphasizing the human free will aspect in its presentation of salvation, more so than the Calvinists with the sovereignty of God, divine election, choice, and foreordination and predestination side of things. And then came something called the Second Great Awakening, right in the early 1800s. It kind of flowed over into the mid-1820s, 30s, 40s. And the key figure in the Second Great Awakening was a man named Charles Finney. Interestingly, Charles Finney had been a Presbyterian in his ordination, but he came to see that he did not agree with the Presbyterian way with regard to salvation, and became adamantly opposed to Calvinism or the Reformed view, even damning of it in much of his later writings. He was a strong proponent of the human will to choose for or against salvation, and that our presentation of the gospel should appeal directly and powerfully to that human choice for or against salvation. And I will say with regard to this also that the Southern Baptist Church began to move from a more Reformed Calvinistic view to a more Arminian free will side. And I mention them because to date, the Southern Baptists are the largest Protestant denomination in America, somewhere around 17 million members, and it moved very decisively towards the Arminian view. So this kind of Arminian view was very appealing with the American culture, the American ethos. Americans wanted freedom from England, and then freedom to make their own choices, freedom to govern themselves. And Arminianism, when it comes to presenting salvation, sounds much more congenial to our freedom with regard to choosing which direction, which path we shall cut, whether good or bad. If you will, to some small degree, I have one of my children who humorously says, "You don't own me." The American spirit is much like that, is it not? You don't own me. Even when it comes to choose whether I will accept salvation or not accept salvation, we would say to God, "You don't own me." No, the freedom to choose for or against is so strong within the American psyche that the Arminian view has great appeal to it. Well, with that background in mind, let us now turn to these 5 questions that will help us to separate between Calvinism, Reformed, and Arminianism, and free will. Here's the first of our questions. It goes like this. In relationship to salvation, how fallen is humanity? In relationship to salvation, how fallen is humanity? And we'll start with the Reformed view, which believes in total depravity. We've mentioned that already. But a better word might be pervasive depravity. And that is to say that the Reformed view looks at the body of what Scripture teaches, and it says that human beings are influenced and tainted by the effects of the fall pervasively. There's no part of the human being that has not been infected and influenced by what happened in the shattering of the image of God back in Genesis chapter 3. It is thoroughgoing from beginning to end. And most importantly for this discussion, the Reformed would say the human will is influenced and corrupted. Not just our minds, not just our emotions, but our will as well has been deeply affected and broken. You know, this goes all the way back to Martin Luther before Calvin. There was a great Catholic theologian and thinker named Erasmus, and he wrote to Luther in the early 1520s a book called The Freedom of the Will. And Luther responded and said, "Oh, thank you, Erasmus. You've gotten to the heart of the matter as nobody else has gotten to it. It does have to do with whether the will is free or not." And classically, Martin Luther wrote back his book, which was entitled The Bondage of the Will. No, said Luther, we don't have a free will when it comes to whether we freely choose for or against salvation. Our wills are bound. We do not have the ability, because the fallenness of humanity has so permeated, so affected the human will, that the only free choice we will make is against accepting and receiving salvation that comes through Jesus Christ. The will is bound not to. We just do not have the goodness, the wherewithal within us, if you will, to say yes to God's offer of salvation unless God intervenes and frees the bound will so that it is able to respond favorably. And that was the view taken up by John Calvin, taken up then again by Theodore Beza, and against which James Arminius would find himself having some heartburn and some difficulty. Which brings us now to the Arminian view of this. How fallen? Well, there are two views here. One Arminian view, represented by Charles Finney, is that the human will or human image of God is only partially broken. You may remember from our lectures that I talked about the image being like looking in a mirror, and the perspective that Charles Finney would have is to say that the mirror is partially shattered, partially broken, but then there is some part of the human likeness or image of God that has remained intact, or at least intact enough that it has the ability to make its own responses and decisions. And the point at which Finney said we still have an intact image of God is the will. The will is not shattered. The will is not fallen. The will is still intact in spite of the fall, enough so that we have the freedom to choose for salvation or against salvation. What Finney would say was that we have absolute power to the contrary. That sounds like a kind of a strange phrase, but it's really important. That means that in any given situation, I have the absolute power to make decision A or the absolute power to go with decision B. It's within my power. For instance, in this lecture right now, I could have absolute power to the contrary to continue with this lecture to the end, or absolute power to the contrary to say, nope, I'm going to click off this recording and cease this right now. That would be an example of what Finney was talking about, except in regard to salvation. I have the absolute power to accept the offer that is given in Jesus Christ or not to, because the will remains intact enough for me to make that decision. It's sometimes called libertarian free will. Well, the other view within Arminianism is represented by Charles Wesley. And what Wesley said was, there is total depravity, or we might call it pervasive depravity, and that depravity, that fallenness, affects the human will. And so if we were just given to our human will, the Calvinists are right. We would not respond favorably to the offer of salvation. But what has God done? What God has done is given every human being what Wesley called prevenient grace. And prevenient simply means to go before. He's given us prevenient grace that elevates the human will, or if you will, reconstructs the human will by grace, so that every human being now does have absolute power to the contrary to say yes to salvation or no to the offer of salvation. So it's a little bit different. The Wesleyan view is a little closer to acknowledging what the Calvinists are saying, but still says through prevenient grace, everybody has the power to make their own free will choice. And as you can see, Finneyite view says the fall was less severe, and we never lost that ability to do that. But both say we have libertarian free will when it comes to choosing salvation. All right, let's move to our second question, which is, how does God call humanity to salvation? How does God call humanity to salvation? The Reformed view, to begin with again, is called unconditional election. What that means, and it's a little confusing, is that God does choose. He does choose whom he will save. And it's not based on any of the conditions within the human being. It's not because John is such a great guy that God chooses him, and Susie is an okay person, so God may or may not choose her, and Frederick down here is just a rotten bum, and so God's not going to choose that person. It's not based on the conditions within the human being, the merit within the person, the character of the person. But the Calvinist Reformed view says it's regardless of all of that. Why? Well, think about the logic here. What Calvinism has said is that everybody's will, everybody's entire being is so fallen that everyone will never choose salvation. It doesn't matter how good or bad or in between somebody is. The mass of all humanity has so fallen away that it will not choose salvation. And therefore there is no condition. There's nothing in us that's meritorious or damning enough that God would consider it sufficient for him to choose for us or against us. It's not conditioned upon us, if you will. So, on the other hand, we think of the Arminian view, which would be the opposite. It's conditional election. And what the Arminian view will say is, God knows everything. God is omnipresent and omniscient. And therefore, God, from before the foundation of the earth, could look down the corridors of time, and he could see who would choose of his or her own free will for salvation. God knows who that's going to be. And he knows who will not freely choose salvation. And so based on that condition, you got the conditionality here, the condition that he knows who will choose for salvation, God so arranges things that those people get to hear the gospel, are persuaded by the gospel, exposed to the gospel, so that foreknowledge, that foreordination that God has will come to pass, because he arranges things so that they can exercise their free will in order to accept salvation. So, if you will, in terms of logic, it is the free will to choose the gospel that comes before God choosing to offer the gospel. But in terms of chronology, God from the foundation of the earth decides he is going to present the gospel so that we who are going to say yes will have that opportunity to use our free will to do so. So God's election is conditional upon whether we will or will not say yes to the offer of salvation. Let's turn to our third issue in this thorny thicket of God's sovereignty and human free will. This is the question. With regard to the atonement, the work of Christ on the cross, who did Jesus die to save? Who did Jesus die on the cross to save? Now, beginning again with the Reformed view, and stay with me on this because there are two positions in the Reformed view that are held very strongly within the Calvinistic side of things, and I need to present them to you because, again, this is theology for geeks, right? So stick with me on this one. The strictly Reformed view would be that the atonement, the work of Christ on the cross, was only for God's elect, for those whom God would choose to give the gift of salvation. And the atonement is not for, and never was intended to be for, anyone but that group of people. And that's why it's limited. It's limited to that group of people. Now, the way the logic goes here is Christ died upon the cross. But why would Christ die for anyone more than those whom God intended to save through the work of Christ on the cross? Why would it be wasted? Why would his atonement be wasted on people who were not going to receive or be chosen by God? No, God doesn't waste anything. God is efficient. And therefore, the blood of Christ on the cross was shed in order to forgive, redeem, and bring salvation only to that group of people whom God would give the gift of salvation, and not to everyone else. So that's the stricter view among Calvinists. Now, the second view among Calvinists is a little more relaxed. I call it the relaxed Reformed view. And what it says is that Jesus on the cross died for everybody. For everybody. It is sufficient for the entire human race, every human being who's ever died. If they all became Christians, Christ's atonement would cover every single one of them. There's no lack in what Jesus did on the cross. But it would say that though it's sufficient for all, it's efficient only for those whom God has chosen, and only for those who will say yes to God's sovereign providential plan for salvation. And this is sometimes called hypothetical universalism, because hypothetically, everybody could be saved. But beyond the hypothesis, in the actuality, the only ones who are saved are the ones whom God enables and provides and ensures will indeed hear the gospel and have their hearts so turned that they receive the gospel by the grace of God. The first group, those really restrict reform, limited atonement, are sometimes called five-point Calvinists. And if you've heard the language, those who believe that the atonement would be sufficient hypothetically for everyone, but efficient only for those who will be saved. They're called oftentimes 4.5-point Calvinists. Now, the Arminian view is a lot simpler here. We don't have to spend as much time on it. They believe in unlimited atonement. The way the logic, of course, flows here is that Jesus died for everyone. And everyone has the free will opportunity to accept or reject the good news of the gospel. They have the free will opportunity, absolute power to the contrary, either because with Charles Finley, their wills are still intact and can make that free decision, or with John Wesley, their will was shattered. But God's given prevenient grace, so they now do once again have that absolute power to the contrary. But either way, both of these groups say the atonement is universally applicable to all who will respond and receive the good news of Christ. Often appealed to here is the great verse of evangelicalism, John 3:16. God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. And Arminians take that right there at face value. If you're a whosoever, you have power to the contrary, for or against. The atonement is available for you. You don't have to wonder whether you're one of the elect. You decide whether you're going to be one of the elect, because you are a whosoever with regard to that. And there's plenty available for you if you will exercise your free will and accept the gift of God that is offered in Jesus Christ. Well, moving along to issue number 4. What effect will saving grace have on human beings? What effect will saving grace have on human beings? Well, the Reformed view believes in efficacious grace. I know it's sometimes called irresistible grace, but I think efficacious is a better word. And that means it will be effective. God's grace is effective for the purpose which he sets out and assigns it. Let's follow the logic once again, because this is a little harder to wrap our minds around as Americans, I think. If everybody is fallen, and so far fallen that we do not have within us the will to choose for salvation, our wills are bound in and of ourselves. And if God in his mercy elects whom he will save out of those, because if he didn't elect any of us, we'd all be damned, because nobody would ever choose salvation. So God has to reach into the human soul and change the human heart and the human soul so that indeed it wants the things of salvation and is able to receive the gift of salvation. And if he doesn't, in his justice, everyone would be condemned. Nobody would be saved. And then Jesus on the cross atones for the sins of those people so that they may be saved. Which brings us now to this point, this efficacious grace. The Calvinist and Reformed person would say it is by the grace of God that God frees the will so that the freed will freely then chooses to accept the gift of salvation. Let me say that again, because it's a little counterintuitive to us, I suspect, many of us anyway. Because our wills are bound, God must free our will. And when he frees our will, he frees the will so that it freely chooses the gift of salvation. Let me give an illustration for this, and no illustration's perfect, but hopefully this one will help a little bit. Pretend with me that a person, hard to believe, but there's a woman who hates ice cream. She's hated ice cream all her life. There's something wrong with this woman, isn't there? She has no desire for ice cream. She's almost repulsed by ice cream. If ever given a chance to eat dessert where it's ice cream or something else, she will 100% of the time choose something else other than ice cream. Well, this poor woman gets in a car accident. It is very severe. She's in a coma for weeks, on the verge of death. But she recovers, amazingly recovers. And lo and behold, when she wakes up, what does she ask for? She says, "Can I have some ice cream?" Well, her family looks at her and says, "What? Who is this? How could you want? You hate ice cream." "No, I just have a craving for ice cream." "Oh, this ice cream is delicious. Can I have some more ice cream?" Of course, they're feeding her ice cream as much as she wants ice cream. They're just glad she's alive, even though they don't understand why now all of a sudden she has this desire for ice cream. Well, bizarre as this may be, no one would say that this woman who survived this accident is not asking for and eating ice cream and enjoying ice cream of her own free will. It may be mysterious that her desire was changed through this auto accident, but nevertheless, She has been converted. Her disposition's been converted from being a hater of ice cream who always freely chose never to have ice cream to a lover of ice cream who always wants to choose for ice cream. Well, hopefully you've seen how this illustration applies to saving grace. The Calvinist Reformed person would say, if God doesn't intervene, we don't want salvation. We will not pursue salvation. We will reject salvation even as this woman would have before the car accident rejected ice cream. But God, in his grace, acts upon us to regenerate us, to give us new life, almost like this woman in the coma came back to a new life. Not quite, but you take the point of the illustration with regard to that. God resurrects us from spiritual death to spiritual life. And when God regenerates our hearts and our souls, what happens? He converts our desire so that no longer are we declining salvation, the gift of salvation, the offer of salvation, but mysteriously he has worked within our souls and given us new life in our souls so that when we hear the word of salvation, we freely accept that gift. We want that gift. We desire that gift. We come to that gift. That gift is almost irresistible to us. It's efficacious. It brings about our salvation. God converts our will and desire, can you see now, so that we freely do choose for the gift of salvation. Every bit as much as the woman who came out of the coma freely chooses to eat ice cream for dessert as often as she wants to. That's what has to happen. God has to do that. He indeed has to give the will a new life, a new desire, a new creation that will then say freely, I want that gift. Otherwise, we never will. The Arminian, on the other side, I'll be briefer because I think it's more straightforward, says we just need to make a free will decision to this gift, offer of salvation. We can accept the gift of salvation. We can resist the gift of salvation. We can reject the gift of salvation. God offers this to everyone through prevenient grace or because we have an unfallen will, and the decision is up to us. Now, to be sure, an Arminian will say, God can try to persuade us. He may try to convince us. He may send people into our lives. He may arrange circumstances so that we will look carefully at this decision. But God will never break our free will ability that is absolute power to the contrary. We always, when we choose salvation, could have equally chosen not to elect salvation, or if we choose not to elect salvation, we could have as easily chosen for salvation. We have our libertarian free will, even though God will indeed try to persuade us. But as is often said by Arminians, God is a gentleman, and God will never force you to do anything, including change your will to accept salvation. And that is inviolable, really, for an Arminian or for someone in the camp with Charles Finney as well. And therefore, an Arminian would freely say that grace is not always efficacious. It can not only be resisted, at the end of the day, it can be outright rejected as well. So this brings us to the fifth and final of our points, which is what happens going forward for those who do accept saving grace? What happens for those who do accept saving grace? Beginning one final time with the Reformed or Calvinistic view, the Reformed believe in the preservation of God's people, or sometimes it's called the perseverance of God's people. As Jesus said in the Gospel of John, no one will pluck my people from my hand. That's a great verse for Jesus assuring that if you are one of Jesus' own, he will make sure nobody plucks you out of his hand. And on one hand, you've heard me use these two words. It's the preservation, which emphasizes that God preserves his people, but it's also perseverance. That is the work of the saint, to be involved, the Christian, in continuing in salvation. So which one is it? Is it preservation or perseverance? And most Reformed people would say both. It is both of these. On one hand, God preserves his people. But how does he preserve his people? Through their perseverance in walking in sanctification and growing in their faith. This is where, indeed, we can refer to John Newton, the most loved of all the hymns in America today, in Free Will Arminian America today. We are a confused group of people. Is Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound. They've done polls, and Amazing Grace comes up at the top of the list easily. But John Newton, who was a Calvinist and Reformed, writes these words in one of the stanzas. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. Now, what is that? Many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. That is perseverance. I've come through the dangers, toils, and snares. I've persevered. But then how does John Newton conclude that stanza? 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. There we have it. You hear it, don't you? The second half of the stanza is all about the preservation of God. It's God's grace that brought me safe thus far through all my perseverance. It's God's grace that will bring me all the way home, no matter what trials and toils and snares I may face. It's preservation through perseverance, as Newton wrote. Now, quick note, for the Reformed person, what is eternal security and what is not eternal security? For the Reformed and Calvinist, eternal security is that God does preserve those who persevere in faithfulness to their deaths. He does preserve those who persevere to their deaths. And a Reformed person will say, it is not that God will preserve anyone who walks an aisle one time and says, I accept Jesus Christ and prays a sinner's prayer, but then turns around and lives the rest of their life on their own terms, in their own way, without any reference to Christ. If you will, the Reformed person will say that if you have been truly saved, if you have accepted Christ and experienced salvation, you will respond necessarily to what Jesus said to his disciples in the Gospels, which is, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of people. And the Reformed person would say, if someone says they accepted Christ and received the gift of salvation, but then never picks up on that by following Jesus in the balance of their life with ups and downs, they may fall away, but come back. It's not going to be perfect. But indeed, true salvation experience has to lead towards the sanctification process. And if there is no sanctification process, if there is no walking out that faith by persevering in that preservation of God, then the Reformed person will say, we're not sure whether there was a true salvation that occurred in the first place. Those who are saved will come and follow Jesus, and those who say they're saved but live as though there's no point of reference to that, probably not saved in the first place. It's the Protestant equivalent with the Roman Catholic who will say, well, you were baptized as a Roman Catholic. That means you're saved because you were baptized into the church, even though you may not live as a Roman Catholic for the balance of your life. It's the same thing in a Protestant view. You walk forward and prayed a sinner's prayer, but then you didn't live as a Christian through the rest of your life. But because you prayed that sinner's prayer, it was the magic that brought you salvation regardless of the rest. And the Reformed person would say it's no more magically efficacious than a Roman Catholic baptizing a baby would be in terms of salvation. There has to be continuation of following of Jesus. That's eternal security. All right, we're finally up to the Arminians, which I would say believe in conditional salvation after becoming a Christian. And this is how it works. According to a consistent Arminian, the only way we are saved is when we exercise our absolute power to the contrary, our free will to accept the gift of salvation. And once we have received that gift of salvation, then God does come into our life through Jesus Christ. He does assist us. He is working within our lives. But He's not working in our lives in a way that removes our free will. We had free will before we accepted Christ. We could have said no. And as we begin and walk with Christ, we still have free will that's able to say yes or no to Christ's work, to the work of salvation in our lives. And a consistent, I think, Arminian will say that because that's true, there still is within even the Christians the ability not only to fall away from salvation for a limited time, but to outright reject salvation, to lose one's salvation. One is not eternally secure in any sense, no more secure than the ability to continue to exercise one's free will, libertarian free will, to say yes to the gospel as one said yes to the gospel when beginning the Christian walk. Now, hopefully that saying yes becomes stronger and stronger as one continues in faithfulness to Christ, but there is always the possibility that one could turn and walk away and lose one's salvation. Now, I mention that as consistent Arminianism because I think there's a lot of inconsistent Arminianism as well. And it would say we have absolute power to the contrary, whether we accept salvation or reject salvation with our libertarian free will. But once we're saved, once we've accepted Christ, once the Spirit is at work within us, then we have eternal security. We will not fall away. We will not lose our salvation once we have accepted of our own free will that salvation. If you will, our wills are converted after salvation so that we cannot lose our salvation, whereas beforehand our wills were free to choose either direction. Which starts to sound a little bit like the Reformed view, if I may say, in terms of how we live out our salvation. It begins to sound like that indeed the human free will has been changed in its desire after accepting salvation so that it will continue in salvation, though beforehand that desire was free to choose for or against. And I think a consistent Arminian would say it was free before, for or against, and it continues to be free afterwards, for or against, but with stronger encouragement to be faithful because of the work of the Spirit in the life. Whereas the consistent Calvinist will say we weren't free beforehand. We had our desires transformed so that we freely accepted the gospel, and the same power that converted our wills to accept the gospel is the same power and grace of God that sees us through faithfully to the completion of our salvation. And I just dwell on that because there really are very, very many, I think, Arminians who are fully free will oriented with regard to choosing for salvation at the beginning, but less fully free will oriented when it comes to the continuation of salvation by our free will. So there you have it. Those are the 5 questions that I think are essential to the different perspectives. The Reformed and Calvinist, that's emphasizing the will of God, the sovereignty of God, the choosing of God. And you can see the Arminian view that tends to fall on the side of our responsibility, our human freedom, our choice with regard to salvation. Now let me wrap up this bonus lecture, which is a little longer than a normal lecture, but that's okay. It's a bonus lecture. This should be good, right? Let me give you 10 questions and suggest to you that you think about how you would answer these 10 questions, either yes or no. In fact, this is a series of 10 questions I, for years, gave to those who were coming on to the session, the elder board, the rulers, servant leaders in the Presbyterian churches which I serve, which will tip the hand for you that I moved from my Arminian childhood on this particular equation when I was a Methodist over to the more Reformed and Calvinistic side of this one, although I would call myself a moderate or a mild Calvinist on this particular subject. But let me give you these 10 questions just to wrap up for you to think about that will give you a self-evaluation about this important topic. And they're all yes or no answers. Number 1, is God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit the author and the source of your salvation? Is God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit the source, the author and the source of your salvation? Yes or no? Second, does God call us before we can respond by calling on Him? Does God call us before we can respond by calling on Him? Yes or no? Number 3, is our salvation fully dependent on God's grace and goodness toward us? Is our salvation fully dependent on God's grace and goodness toward us? Number 4, is our salvation in no way dependent on our goodness or our good works or our being good people? Is our salvation in no way dependent on our goodness, our good works, or our being good people? Yes or no? Number 5, is our salvation therefore fully and truly a gift given by God? Is our salvation therefore fully and truly a gift given by God? What do you say? Yes or no? Question number 6. Does God not only give us the gift of coming to faith, but does he also give us grace needed to continue in faith throughout our lives? Does God not only give us the gift to come to faith, but also the grace to continue in faith throughout our lives? Question number 7, another yes or no. At the same time, are we to be working out our salvation with full energy, trusting that God is working in us to grow us in salvation? Again, at the same time, are we working out our salvation with full energy, trusting that God is working in us to grow us in our salvation? Question 8, yes or no. Is our assurance of salvation dependent on what Jesus did for us and dependent on what the Spirit continues to do in us, and it's not an assurance based on our good works after coming to faith? Is our assurance of salvation dependent on what Jesus has done for us and what the Spirit continues to do in us? And is it not an assurance based on our good works after coming to faith? Question 9. Do we love our Father for adopting us as his children and making us members of his family? Do we love God for adopting us as his children and making us members of his family? Yes or no? And 10th and finally, do we leave to the mystery of God, to the mystery of God's will, the knowledge of who will and who will not come to faith, knowing that our calling is to proclaim the good news to all people in all places at all times? Yes or no? Do we leave to the mystery of God's will, the knowledge of who will and who will not come to faith, knowing that it is our calling to proclaim the good news to all people in all times and in all places? All right, how did you answer? How many do you say yes to, and how many do you say no to? And maybe you're wrestling with some of those. It may be yes, but what do you mean by that? Or yes, but with some qualifications. Let me simply tell you, with regard to the elders in my Presbyterian churches, if you were able to say yes to all 10 of those, then you would be sufficiently on the Reformed and Calvinistic view to have been ordained as an elder, a servant leader, in one of those Presbyterian congregations. But if you found yourself saying no to a number or several of these, or questioning these 10, then it might have meant that you were actually more on the Arminian side of the equation, more comfortable with this libertarian free will, absolute power to the contrary, and human involvement with regard to election and salvation. And I will tell you that I had occasions where people who were being candidates for being an elder went through these questions, and most of them said, absolutely, I can affirm all of that with good conscience without getting too deep into the mystery of predestination, and that was good and fine. But I would occasionally have someone say, you know, if that's the entry level for being a Calvinist or Reformed, a moderate Calvinist or Reformed, then I think I'm an Arminian and maybe I should step away from being a leader in the Presbyterian Church. So wrestle with it for yourself. See where you come out with regard to this very thorny issue within the Protestant and Evangelical Church. So thanks for joining me, Tim Janosewski, Spotlight Good News, for this bonus lecture as we consider the great subjects of systematic theology as we spotlight theology so that we might live faithfully to the glory of God. And we will talk to you next time.